Lore of the Old World, Episode 1, The Beginning. The world has not always been ruled by the races that battle over it today. It was once a cold and desolate place, a home to great beasts of forgotten legend. For unknown millennia these creatures vied for supremacy, and for millennia more this might have continued. Alas, when an enigmatic race of starfarers rode down from the heavens aboard flaming chariots, the world was set upon a new path. The history of the Old World began long before men forged their empires upon the land, before dwarves carved their cavernous domain beneath the mountains, even before elves first plied the ocean waves. An epoch ago, as it turned slowly under a cold and distant sun, the world was populated by gigantic beasts. Cold-blooded gargants stalked the mountain peaks. Great blind behemoths tunneled beneath the earth. Segmented leviathans swam beneath the waves, and more besides. Far from unthinking, many of these elder creatures held their own domains and ambitions, and for long aeons the ground shook as titanic monsters warred. Of all these strange breeds, it was the intelligent and articulate, vicious and ruthless race of dragons that ruled supreme over the primal world. They soared between the mountain peaks, bringing war to the gargants, made their colossal lairs within the underground realms of behemoths, and hunted above the ocean waves, preying upon the leviathans as they preyed upon one another. Yet despite their preeminence, the dragons were ill prepared for the arrival of beings from beyond the boundaries of their own meagre reality. The age of dragons was not to last. Mysterious in origin and near omnipotent in nature, the race known only as the Old Ones had plied the depths of the cosmos in magnificent silvered ships since time itself began. They had looked upon the world from above, and found it to be good. By their reckoning, this world might play an important role in destiny, a place where great powers would vie for supremacy. They saw in the world the seed of something unknown and, as yet, unknowable, ripe with the promise of new realms and realities that might, in some distant future, erupt from the fires of destruction and chaos that would come to ravage this reality. For how long the Old Ones watched and studied their prize from afar, laying plans that would irrevocably change the very stuff of reality, none can even guess. Perhaps mere moments passed between their discovery of the world and the commencement of their great works. Perhaps they hung unseen in the heavens for aeons, watching the great beasts far below make endless war on one another. Whatever the case, when the Old Ones stepped into the world, it was as if the gods themselves had set foot upon the soil, their mere presence proving a catalyst to changes that would spell the doom of the creatures that walked the world before them. At the poles of the world, great gates were constructed through which the servants of the Old Ones rode from realms unknown upon zephyrs of magic power. They brought with them great machines of arcane science, world-building engines, with which they would reform the land and seas into more pleasing geometries. The first of these servants were the Slan, corpulent and toad-like, yet possessing profound knowledge of matters both philosophical and scientific. The Slan were the chief engineers of the Old Ones' plan, and it was they who interpreted the Old Ones' will and committed their instructions onto sacred plaques, crystallized from pure thought. At the bidding of their masters, the Slan manipulated the world engines and steered the planet's path towards the warming light of its distant sun. In the turmoil of this great undertaking, mountains were shattered and rebuilt. Land masses were moved upon their foundations in accordance with ancient prophecies and patterns, and oceans were drained and created anew. The Slan in turn were served by multitudinous legions of lizard men, spawned in their millions to serve as labourers and warriors. Vast armies of lizard men marched across the swiftly evolving face of the world. They felled forests, shaped rock, and raised vast temple cities towards the heavens, majestic monuments in which the Slan would reside. and they battled those monstrous denizens of the prehistoric world that had survived the coming of the Old Ones, driving the gargantuan beasts into desperate flight, to cower in the deepest and darkest corners of the world, lest they face utter annihilation. As the lizard men laboured, the Old Ones turned their attention to populating the paradise they were creating, bringing many new races into being. Some believed they hoped to determine which traits were the most important for a successful and long-lived civilization. Others suspect the young races were created only to protect their paradise realm from some unknown threat. First among the young races were the elves. Blessed with dexterity, intelligence and grace, they easily learned the skills of civilization and showed tremendous aptitude for controlling the constant flow of magic that entered the world through the polar gates. The elves were soon joined by the dwarves. Beings in many ways their opposite, dwarfs were doughty and stalwart folk, resistant to magic but skilled workers of metal and stone. Surging in great numbers from the barren wasteland of the world came orcs and goblins, crude creatures, more interested in fighting one another and hunting prey than in the ways of civilization. They had come to the world aboard the mighty vehicles of the Old Ones, stowed away in secret, and they had prospered greatly upon the warm and lush world. Later came the race of men, adaptable and prolific, so vital and ingenious that they would easily adjust to almost any environment. Lastly were perhaps the most unfinished of the Old Ones' creations, the somewhat vulgar races of the halflings and the ogres, radically different in size and strength, but remarkably resistant to the baleful lure of the magical world. Unbeknownst to the Old Ones toiling upon their great works, disaster loomed. To drive their world-building engines and facilitate their interstellar travels, the Old Ones relied upon sorcerous power drawn from an alternate dimension, one that lay beyond the physical reality they themselves occupied. In ages long past, the Old Ones had learnt of this etheric otherworld and tapped into its limitless reserves of raw magic. Over long millennia of study, they had reasoned that by opening gateways into the roiling heart of the aether, they might travel almost instantaneously through the interstellar depths. In this assumption they were correct, and in time they constructed a great network of gateways and tunnels through the magical realm, linking together the many worlds of their vast cosmic empire. What the Old Ones had failed to comprehend was the power of the beings that inhabited this reality. Vast and predatory creatures dwelled within the aether, creatures that simultaneously resented the intrusion of the Old Ones into their domain and hungered for the warmth and vitality of the Old Ones' alien realm. Creatures of pure energy and emotion, the denizens of the aether, were drawn towards the vibrant energy of the young world, and they gathered close about the gateways of the Old Ones. They peered through the metaphorical veil that separated the dimensions, whispering promises and lies to the creatures that dwelt there. Carried upon the winds of magic that flowed endlessly through the gateways, these whispers reached the ears of both those beasts that survived from the bygone era and the young races alike. Where they were heard, these whispers seduced and corrupted the minds of many, luring them into the worship of ruinous powers that crept into their dreams, masquerading as beneficent gods. Upon every mortal soul corrupted, the creatures of the aether fed hungrily and grew in power. As grew their power, so grew their hunger, and they pressed ever more forcefully against the barriers that separated them from the sustenance they craved. Under the unrelenting pressure of these entities' attention, the portals above the poles of the world, each larger than a mountain, began to bend and break, eventually collapsing in an epoch-shattering implosion. In an instant, the gates were replaced by a boiling sea of chaos, where the physical world and the other world overlapped, a yawning chasm in the stuff of reality, revealing the realm of chaos that lay beyond. In that moment, the Old Ones disappeared from the world, their tenuous connection to this realm severed with absolute finality. Whether they were slain by the psychic trauma of the event, or merely banished into a distant shadow realm, none can say. In the sadness of their departure, the Old Ones left a great void, which the forces of chaos rushed to fill, and all that remained in their wake were the ghostly echoes of their former greatness, vague memories of what they had been. Where once the polar gates had stood, an impossible wound in the fabric of reality now gaped, spewing raw chaos into the world, which coalesced, upon contact with reality, into the unnatural black rock known as Warpstone. So great was this eruption that a new moon was formed in the heavens above the young world, Moorsleep, the Chaos Moon. With the birth of this evil satellite, the world was rocked in its orbit, and the land masses shook upon their foundations, while the ever-growing tear in reality threatened to consume everything, and the worst had barely yet begun. From the tortured heavens, pulsing comets fell upon the trembling earth, contrails of unlight flaring in their wake as they plummeted towards the vibrant green lands below. They crashed into the world, felling endless tracts of forests and burying themselves inside massive craters of scorched earth. With each impact, the land was infected further by the raw stuff of chaos. Its insidious taint worked outwards into the fertile soil, suckled upon by the roots of ancient trees and seeped into the air breathed by the nomads and the beasts that populated the land. As chaos permeated all, the forests stirred, writhing with malign energies. Weird calls echoed from the trees as the woods thrashed with rampant growth. Strange and terrible processes were enacted in that dank, boiling cauldron of fecundity. The primitives of the regions and the beasts of the forest were somehow mated, their terrible offspring born and mated again, generation after generation coming into being, indiscriminately reproducing and eventually dying in an uncontrolled and rapid procession. From the great roiling storm of magic that surged in the heavens above, riding upon the unleashed winds of magic that blew a hurricane gale about the doomed world, came a coruscating army of 1 billion fiends. These demonic creatures of the magical realm, servants of the ruinous powers that dwelt within the aether, given life by the nightmares of mortals, were set loose upon a plane of existence on which they should never have trod. As the disaster unfolded, the oldest and wisest of the Slan Mage priests acted. Through a monumental outpouring of arcane might, they halted the tearing of the material realm. Wrestling with forces greater than anything they had encountered before, the Slan stabilized the globe, slowing its erratic flight through the angry heavens and setting it back upon its correct orbit around its distant sun. So great was the effort that many of the older Slan expired, even as they battled to halt the cataclysm. Hundreds more died in the days that followed, their vitality consumed by their efforts to hold back the demonic invaders. Those that remained possessed only a fragment of the wisdom of their elders. They did not know the deeper secrets of the Old Ones. They were not masters of the aether, and they couldn't traverse the interstellar deeps. Of the geomantic web, the arcane construction of their forebears, they understood only rudimentary details, and they had not the knowledge of their master's great plans. By events beyond their reckoning, they had inherited a duty beyond their means, the preservation of the world, and the completion of the Old One's great plan. Chaos had come to the world, and its defenders had been utterly overwhelmed. With the great cataclysm, a terrible war began. Faced with annihilation, the remaining Slan rallied, mustering armies of lizardmen of such size their like has not been seen in the world since. These armies marched forth to meet the demon legions in battles that spanned continents, lasted centuries, and claimed untold lives. Even as the lizardmen met the demonic tide with primordial ferocity, the Slan harnessed the rampant magical energies to fuel spells of unprecedented destruction. They gulped in the magic-infused air and belched forth firestorms, unleashing tidal waves and split the earth asunder to lay waste to the invaders. But demonic reinforcements continued to flow into the world, and the balance began to shift. The Slan felt their powers weaken as the raw and chaotic magic that flooded the world grew ever harder to control. while the unconstrained winds of magic wore heavily upon the Slann, sapping their strength, they invigorated the demonic legions, for they were born of the unnatural stuff and could readily shape it for their own use. As the magical supremacy shifted, so too did the war. Yet the war was not fought by the servants of the Old Ones alone. Across the seas the young races, the elves of Ulthuan and the dwarves of the Old World, had not been idle. In the centuries that followed the Great Cataclysm, these races had grown strong through hardship, and their armies stood firm in the defence of their lands. In the World's Edge Mountains, Grungni, the first dwarf and ancestor god of his race, had long ago warned his people that a time of great peril might come. In his wisdom he had commanded them to take refuge deep beneath the mountains, where they had sheltered as the Great Cataclysm unfolded. When the tempest had finally passed, the dwarves had emerged once more from their vast underground realm and found the world above a very different place. The sky was dark and the land barren. Mutated beasts and unnatural monstrosities prowled the mountain peaks, and besieging armies gathered hungrily outside mighty dwarf-built gates. Yet the hordes of chaos quickly found that the dwarfs were far from defenceless, and eager to reclaim the lands they had once worked. In their long years beneath the mountains, Grungni had taught his people to inscribe magical runes onto their weapons and armour, allowing them to stand against the creatures of chaos that assaulted them. And Valea, wife of Grungni, had used her protections to ward off the dark magic of their enemies, dampening their dread powers. But it was Grimnir, the blazing warrior god of the dwarfs, who would lead his people to war. With their rage-filled and wrathful champion at their fore, mighty dwarves' throngs spilled forth from their strongholds. These mighty hosts marched across the continent, spanning mountains ranges of the Old World, slaying demons and routing armies of mutant savages. Where Grimnir led, his warriors followed, and the hordes of chaos trembled. Far from the World's Edge Mountains, the salvation of the elves and their island nation of Ulthuan came in the form of Anarion, a wanderer who had long travelled the world, witnessing firsthand the growing might of chaos, and returning to Ulthuan in its time of need. Finding his once fair homeland war-torn and ruined, Anarion turned to Asurion, the creator god, for aid. Over many long days he burned countless offerings in the sacred flame of Asurion's shrine, but if the god heard, he gave no sign. Finally, in desperation, Anarion cast himself bodily into the sacred fire, offering his own life if Asurion would save his people. By some miracle, Anarion emerged from the flame unscathed and transformed. The spirit of Asurion had entered him, filling him with a radiance that all could see. Anarion had become the vessel of a transcendent power, and when he spoke, elves hastened to obey. With the great mage Kelador, dragon tamer, at his side, Anarion oversaw the training of elven warriors and the raising of Ulthuan's armies. For a century or more, Anarion, now crowned Phoenix Prince by his people, rode to war against the demonic legions, mounted upon the great dragon Indrognir. Behind him rode the princes of Ulthuan, each mounted atop a great worm, and behind each of these marched the serried ranks of Ulthuan's gleaming host. Led by their king, the elven armies won many glorious victories, driving the foul hordes of chaos back from the borders of Ulthuan. In the distant east, the lands that would one day come to be known as Grand Cathay found salvation in the form of a being more ancient and powerful than any mere god or demon. Since before the coming of the Old Ones, the celestial dragon had ruled the east, an apex predator before which all others had bowed. When the Old Ones had first stepped upon the world, changing the shape of the lands and seas, the celestial dragon had chosen caution and avoided confrontation. Where others of his kind had fought the Old Ones, he had learned their ways. As the world grew warm and became saturated with magic, he studied their arcane sciences, becoming a hidden master of their arts. When the ruinous powers began to whisper their promises into his slumbering mind, the wise and thoughtful celestial dragon pondered their words, and saw in them only the threat of coming destruction and despair. He looked at the humans now populating his lands, simple but respectful creatures, and knew that his honour required him to protect them and lead them through the trials ahead. So it was that the celestial dragon defended his lands against the rampaging demonic legions. Together with his mate, the moon dragon, and their 9 draconic children, he did battle with the demonic legions, driving them from his lands. And for his efforts, the young races of Cathay learned to shun gods and demons and to bow down before dragons. Despite many victories by the armies of order, the demonic legions continued to assail the world, and as the war ground on and decades turned into centuries, wave upon wave of demons, each more numerous than the last, sought to topple the servants of the Old Ones. The armies of the Slann were forced ever back, relinquishing their tropical paradise realm to the ravages of chaos, and retreating into the shelter of their temple cities. Here they fought a furious defence against the besieging enemy, protected by magical wards so potent that no demon should ever breach them. Yet breach them the demons did. Slowly at first, the demonic attacks weakened the defences of the temple cities, but as the years wore on and the ferocity of the assaults increased, the damage caused to the defences grew while the strength of the Slann waned. The first temple city to fall was Zahutek, its wards collapsing in a kaleidoscopic explosion. Once the first temple city fell, others quickly followed, until eventually the demonic legions massed at the walls of Itza. The first city and linchpin of the Slann's arcane defences, Itza, was under the protection of Lord Croak, the first Slann to have gazed upon the world and the mightiest of mages. A great dome of energy surrounded Itza, crackling with Croak's power, turning demons to dust as they railed against it. Yet after years of strain, even Lord Croak could sustain such mystic walls no longer, and with a final surge, the Slann exploded the barrier outwards, flattening the jungle for many leagues around. 100,000 demons were banished in an instant, but the hundreds of thousands that remained swarmed into Itza. Of all that long war, no battle was fiercer than the one fought in the streets of Itza. Only an epic stand by Lord Croak's armies prevented the demons from overrunning the Great Pyramid. For many days and nights, lizardmen warriors stood firm on the lofty bridge of stars, whilst Lord Croak gathered his power. As the last of the defenders was cut down, the Slann encountered spells that were the preserve of gods, and fire rained from the heavens, banishing demons by the million. Time stood still as the fabric of the universe strained against the unleashed power, yet eventually Lord Croak faltered, and a host of greater demons, the mightiest servants of the ruinous powers, descended from all points of the compass on the Slann's corporeal form, tearing it apart in a moment of primal fury. So powerful was Lord Croak that its spirit refused to succumb to the death of its mortal vessel. Set free of its flesh, Croak's will became a roiling storm of tremendous power that descended upon the city with fury, scouring the invaders with a divine light that was like unto a second sun. The first city was saved, and the transcendent Slann immediately began devising spells that would banish the hordes of chaos from the world forever. In the wake of the defence of Itza, Lord Croak's loyal skink attendants lamented the death of their almighty master, whose body was scattered far and wide. Diligently the skinks collected every last scrap of that ravaged body, and with great reverence the remains were swathed in resin-soaked wrappings. Thus was created the first of many relic priests. The lizardmen have found the spirits of departed Slann so powerful that they often linger near the former bodies, and in times of need, a relic priest is brought forth from hidden crypts to enact once more the great plan of the Old Ones. Far from Lustria, the armies of the dwarves appeared undefeatable with Grimnir at their head. Where the ancestor god led, whole armies of demons were vanquished, and before his wrath mutants and degenerate beasts fled. Yet for every victory won, the price was great, and the grief felt for every fallen dwarf warrior weighed heavily upon Grimnir's heart, filling him with anger and guilt. Long did Grimnir brood, blaming himself for the terrible losses suffered by his people, and questioning his worthiness as their protector. So melancholic became the ancestor, that he refused to hear the wise counsel of his king, Grumni and Velea, and his mood grew ever darker. In the depths of his brooding, Grimnir formed a plan to end the woes of his people, and defeat the hordes of chaos without further loss of dwarf lives. The dwarfs had heard tell from their distant ally, Kalidor Dragontamer, of the Old One's polar gates, of their collapse and of the roaring portal into the realm of chaos that now stood in their place. Grimnir swore an oath that he would travel beyond this portal and challenge the gods of chaos, the commanders of the demonic legions invading his realm and slaying his people in their own hellish domain, and, should he stand victorious, close and seal the broken portal from the other side so that no more demons may enter the world. Upon hearing Grimnir's plan, his kin were horrified. They saw in his quest only death, and told him as much. But Grimnir would not be swayed from his path, declaring that to atone for his failings and to avenge the many dwarfs laid low fighting in his name, he was honour-bound to seek a mighty doom. In preparation for his lonely journey north, Grimnir took rough shears and cut his long beard short, and drew his bright red hair into fearsome spikes with animal fat. Next he stripped his body of his armour, and had powerful runes of protection and vengeance tattooed upon his skin. Finally he gave one of his great rune-inscribed axes to Morgrim, his firstborn son, who, despite Grimnir's protestations, followed his father, insisting that someone must accompany him on his journey into the north, and record the success or failure of his quest. Reluctantly Grimnir agreed, and the pair left their hold, singing a mournful dirge. So it was that Grimnir left his people to do battle with the gods of chaos, passing from history and into legend. Put your trust in stone and iron. Stone and iron have always been true friends of the dwarfs. Old dwarf saying. In Ulthuan, the peace won by Anarion's armies was to prove both fragile and short-lived. When demons overran the province of Avalorn, Astariel, ever-queen of Ulthuan and wife to Anarion, was slain. Worse, the royal couple's children no trace could be found, and it was believed they had been stolen away by the hordes of chaos. So great was Anarion's anguish at this loss that his mind became fractured. In his madness and grief, the Phoenix King mounted Yggdragnir and rode for the Blighted Isle. There he stood before the altar of Cain, the god of war and death, and drew the Widowmaker, a weapon of terrible power that had waited, embedded in the black stone since the beginning of time. As old as the world itself, the Widowmaker was the ultimate weapon, death itself made manifest, a splinter of the fell weapon wielded by the death god Cain, capable of slaying mortals and gods alike. Upon Anarion's return, those elves most embittered by the war flocked to his side, and the brooding Phoenix King set up court in the dismal land of Nagaroth. For a time, wielding the Widowmaker, Anarion was all but undefeatable, an avatar of death that slew enemies by the thousands, as he led his grim warriors against the demonic armies. Yet, despite Anarion's victories, demonic hosts continued to assemble on the borders of Ulthuan, and it became obvious to all but the Phoenix King that the war was lost and Ulthuan doomed. It was Kalidor Dragontamer, wisest and most ancient of sorcerers, who would devise a plan of salvation for his people. Fully aware of Anarion's incipient madness, and fearing that his king would blindly lead the armies of Ulthuan into destruction, Kalidor and his fellow mages devised a plan to create a cosmic vortex which they hoped would drain magic from the world, and with it, the demons who rode upon its fury. It was a desperate plan with little hope of success and great potential for catastrophe. but many thought it preferable to slowly descending into the madness of the Phoenix King, whilst Ulthuan, and perhaps even the world, faced certain destruction before the gathering hordes of chaos. At Caledor's instruction, a vast pattern of waystones was erected around Ulthuan, their careful placement augmenting the power of a network of far older stones, each a node of power within the geomantic web created long ago by the servants of the Old Ones. With the waystones complete, Calidor and his mages gathered upon the Isle of Dead to undertake a great ritual to awaken their power. Yet even as the ritual progressed, a demonic host of unprecedented size descended upon Ulthuan, where it was met by the wrath of Anarion. Whether it was the arcane mastery of Lord Croak, the heroism of Grimnir, or Calidor's great ritual that turned the tide of the Long War, none could say. In truth, either thanks to the intervention of some unknown cosmic power, or due to a humble but serendipitous twist of fate, these great acts of defiance in the face of chaos converged, and the storm of magic that had raged for more than 1,000 years subsided. In the immediate aftermath of Calidor's great ritual, as the tumult of battle died, and the surviving elves gulped deep breaths of the suddenly still, cool air, Anarion, visibly wounded almost unto death, mounted in Drognir once more, proclaiming that he would return the Widowmaker to the dread altar from which he drew it. None spoke out, too shaken were they by the battle they had fought and the ritual they had witnessed. Of Calidor and his mages there was no sign. Where they had stood raged a vortex of arcane power, burning with all the colours of magic. In the days that followed, seers and scholars would begin the task of trying to understand the ritual and the vortex, but they never truly would. Of Anarion, nothing more was seen. In time, the elves were left with little choice but to acknowledge that the first Phoenix King was lost to them, and a successor was selected. Belshazzar, the explorer, who would travel the world founding many elven colonies and striking alliances with other races. Thousands of miles away in the world's edge mountains, dwarf throngs marched once more, hunting the mutant beasts of chaos, worshipping savages that lingered in their lands. They too would explore the world, pushing north and east to found more holds, and in time they would renew their acquaintance with the elves as they built settlements along the coasts of the Old World. In Lustria, the surviving Slan began the impossible task of setting the world to rights. They knew not what had happened or what the future held, and for all their wisdom could envisage no other path than to set about ensuring the Old One's great plans were enacted. Yet with the passing of the oldest of their kind, those that had conversed with the Old Ones directly, the young Slan that remained would never truly comprehend the subtleties of their lost master's plans. And whatever the dream of the Old Ones had been, it would never be realized. And yet perhaps this was what the Old Ones had dreamed of. Perhaps this is what they had foreseen all along: the coming of chaos, their demise, and the birthing of a world in which mighty powers would battle, where great legends would unfold, and great acts of heroism would play out. A world which would live long in the memories of gods and mortals, but which, in the fullness of time, would transcend beyond the humble reality it occupied.